We're going to get to your RotoBaller starts and sits at the wide receiver position in just a second, but here is your weekly update when it comes to Mike Evans. And you know what? It could be better. On Sunday, Evans hauled in 4 of his 5 targets for 69 yards. With those 69 yards, Evans pushes his 2024 total to 590, leaving him 410 receiving yards shy of his 11th consecutive 1,000-yard season to begin his career. If Evans is going to continue the streak, he's going to need to average 102.5 yards per game to close out the season. Now on to some great news. Let's talk about players coming back here for the first round of your fantasy playoffs. This week, we get Zay Flowers, Cortland Sutton, Nico Collins, Michael Pittman Jr., and Terry McLaurin back into our lineups. And just because some of those elite options are coming back doesn't necessarily mean you're going to start them. Are you? Now, hey, George Pickens is a guy that is a potential hole in our fantasy lineups this week as he is dealing with a grade 2 hamstring sprain. Now, let's get to it here. Here are those RotoBaller Week 15 starts and sits at the wide receiver position. Starting with Jerry Jeudy of the Cleveland Browns as they take on the Kansas City Chiefs. If you haven't figured it out by now, Jerry Jeudy is about as close to a must start as you're going to find in fantasy these days. Heading into Week 15, the Browns pass catcher has climbed to the top 12 amongst fantasy wide receivers thanks to his 181.4 fantasy points, many of which have come since the arrival of Jameis Winston. Since week number 8, Jeudy has averaged 21 fantasy points per contest, a number that only the Bengals duo of Jamar Chase and T. Higgins can claim to have bettered over the 7 weeks. Jeudy can also stake claim to 7 consecutive games in which he's produced over 12.5 fantasy points. In a world of what could have been, if you average out Jeudy's production since the insertion of Winston, that would project out to 108 receptions, 1,921 receiving yards, and 9 touchdowns. Of Jeudy's 944 receiving yards, which by the way is the 3rd most in the NFL, 72% of them have come in the 6 games in which Winston has been under center. In a matchup against the Denver Broncos, Jeudy, he was moved around to avoid Patrick Surtain, playing a third of his snaps from the slot. And I would expect that to be the case once again as the Browns continue to move him around when they face the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, Kansas City, they are allowing 41.48 fantasy points over the last 4 weeks, which happens to be the 4th most over that time frame. That is good news for Jerry Jeudy. Now, another wide receiver I'm firing up this week is Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders as they take on the Atlanta Falcons. If fantasy managers basically casted aside Jerry Jeudy, the people simply forgot that Jacoby Myers existed in this fantasy world in which we're living in. Quietly, Myers has gone on to average 14.2 fantasy points per game this season and has tallied 13 or more fantasy points in 6 of the last 7 contests, and he currently resides as the wide receiver 23 heading into Monday Night Football's conclusion of week number 14. If there was a week that maybe you might hesitate to put Myers back in your lineup, it could have been this week. Gardner Minshew, he was lost for the season a couple weeks ago, but luckily, Aiden O'Connell, who had to step aside last week, he had an MRI on Monday, which revealed just a bone bruise, keeping Myers' fantasy fate out of the hands of Desmond Ridder, at least for another week or so. Now, heading into last week, Myers was averaging 15 points per game there in games in which Devontae Adams wasn't around. He had also seen a target share of greater than 32% in 3 of the previous 4 contests. That volume continued in week number 14 as Myers finished with 13.7 fantasy points along with a 27% target share and a 29.6% first read target share. Against Atlanta, those kind of opportunities lend themselves to fantasy production. Over the last 4 weeks, Atlanta has been allowing 42.10 fantasy points per game, the 3rd most. On this season, they've allowed 2,084 receiving yards on 178 receptions, not to mention a league-high 20 touchdowns surrendered to opposing wide receivers. The 3rd wide receiver you're firing up, how about scary Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders as they take on the New Orleans Saints? And yes, everything about Terry McLaurin this season has been scary for opposing defensive backs. Over the last 4 weeks, only the Broncos, Chiefs, Chargers, and Texans have allowed more receiving yards to the position than the 650 conceded by the Saints. Over that stretch, the Saints have also allowed 4 receiving touchdowns and have allowed a league-high 44.53 fantasy points against. New Orleans, they have struggled to defend receivers all season long. It's been more than just this 4-week sample that we're talking about. On the season, they've been allowing 35.84 fantasy points per game, which is the 6th most. Now, coming out of the bye, McLaurin's 896 receiving yards ranks inside the top 7 amongst pass catchers. McLaurin's 9 touchdown receptions, that ranks second, trailing only Jamar Chase. and he's averaging 14.7 yards per reception. Not too bad. Now, since week number 4, the numbers are even better. He has averaged 17.1 fantasy points per game, and during this 10-week stretch here, he is averaging 0.23 targets per route run, while seeing a target share of 20.5% and accounting for 37.3% of the Commanders' air yards. McLaurin, he's also averaged 2.68 yards per route run over that period, and that puts him ahead of guys like Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and George Pickens, as he's made the most of his 26.1% of his first read target shares. Now, I don't know if the Saints are going to have an answer for McLaurin. The only way I see McLaurin falling short of fantasy expectations this week is if the Commanders get out early and close out the game by running the ball basically by halftime. Now, the sits of this week, we're going to start with George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers taking on the Philadelphia Eagles in the city of brotherly love. And trust me, the Eagles will have no love for George Pickens this week. That is, if he plays, because he missed last week with that grade 2 hamstring strain. So his week 15 status, it is still up in the air. And as good as Pickens has been, this is an uphill battle that he's going to fight on two fronts. Not only does he have to contend with that soft tissue injury, but waiting for him on the other side of the sideline is Quinyon Mitchell, who's had some success eliminating some of the best fantasy receivers in the game today. If Pickens were able to return to the lineup this week, the risk of re-aggravation on that hamstring seems too significant for fantasy managers to take a chance on. At best, he serves as a decoy out there, ties up Mitchell, so the Steelers could find an advantage somewhere else on the field. Then again, where's that going to be? Philadelphia has been one of the top teams when facing opposing wide receivers over the last 4 weeks. They've allowed just 388 receiving yards on 42 receptions, earning a league best 23.20 fantasy points against. Now, during the season, they're allowing 29.23 fantasy points per game against. That happens to be the 5th fewest, while allowing the 2nd fewest receiving yards. No matter how you look at it, it's simply better just to avoid Pickens altogether this week. Another wide receiver I'm avoiding is Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers as they take on the Seattle Seahawks in the Pacific Northwest. From one good defense against wide receiver position to another one in recent weeks. Over the last 4 weeks, Seattle has allowed just 31 receptions, 325 yards, and a pair of touchdowns to the position. For those keeping track at home, that works out to about 25.4 fantasy points per game. That is the 3rd fewest. Now, we cannot put our fate in Jaden Reed's hands either, because despite checking in as the wide receiver 18 on the season, Reed laid a goose egg, a big 0 last week, and he's gone on to record fewer than 10 fantasy points in 5 of the previous 7 contests. Reed, we know there's always going to be fantasy upside there, as was evident back in week number 1 when he recorded 31.1 fantasy points. That game alone accounted for 19.7% of Reed's fantasy production this season. Remove that game and Reed drops from wide receiver 18 down to wide receiver 30. And another wide receiver I'm dropping out of my starting lineup this week is DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks in that same Green Bay-Seattle matchup. Hey, as much as I love DK Metcalf, 2 things are starting to take shape. 1, the matchup, it's brutal. Green Bay has allowed just 26.9 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks and 30.28, which is the 9th best throughout the season. In 13 games, the Packers have allowed just 1,720 receiving yards and 12 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers. Second, you take all that potential production and you have to split that up between Metcalf and Jackson Smith-Njigba. And guess what? 2/3 of that production, it is going to JSN. Curling JSN, he sits in the top 6 in receiving yards this season with 911. That's 99 more than Metcalf. And the real disparity comes in the fantasy production, as JSN's additional 21 receptions and 2 touchdowns, that equates to the difference between wide receiver 5 and the wide receiver 29 so far, which DK Metcalf finds himself sitting. Now, over the last 4 weeks, JSN, he's averaged 18.3 fantasy points per game compared to DK Metcalf's 10.9. In a less than favorable matchup with likely fantasy production being divided, I'd rather not risk my fantasy playoffs relying on that one big play from Metcalf. We know it's possible, we've seen it happen, but the odds are stacked against it. But hey, if you want to stack the odds in your favor, head to RotoBaller.com for all the latest fantasy news and analysis, and head over to the Discord channel where you'll catch me there 24/7 answering all your fantasy football questions. See you next time.